in order to construct a model of a monopolist, just like we did for perfect competition, one of the first things we have to address is exactly where does marginal revenue and marginal cost equal one another. That would be the profit maximizing output level. And the first type of monopoly we're going to explore in this case is a patent monopoly. Now, a patent monopoly, simply produces a product. And if we assume that product has some sort of assembly line process to it, then the marginal cost curve is going to have the same sort of characteristic, that upward sloping but U-shaped at early stages of output, that a perfectly competitive firm has. And if it has that U-shaped marginal cost curve, it's going to have the standard average cost curves as well. So we already know what that model looks like, okay, what that cost model looks like then for a patent monopolist. What we don't know, however, is what the marginal revenue function looks like. Now, if we remember under perfect competition, the marginal revenue curve was horizontal. And that is because perfectly competitive firms are producing homogeneous products, and they're all small relative to the industry size, okay? Meaning that in order for a perfectly competitive firm to sell more product, all it had to do was increase its level of output. It was so small relative to the size of the rest of the industry that the market could easily absorb Farmer Bob producing an extra 500 bushels of corn. The market had no issues absorbing that increase in corn production at the going market price. But there's a unique characteristic about a monopoly, and that's the fact that it is the only firm in the industry. What does that mean? That means in the marketplace, that demand curve that we all know and love as the market demand curve is exactly the demand curve that the patent monopolist or any monopolist faces. Okay? In other words, unlike under perfect competition, where the demand curve reflected a perfect elasticity and a perfect substitutability of the product line, and therefore equated with marginal revenue and the price of the product, the demand facing a monopolist is the market demand for that product. Okay. Now, what this means with regard to marginal revenue is that a monopolist can't just produce more product and make more money. In order for it can produce more product, but in order for it to sell more product, it has to lower the price level in order to do so, because it's facing a downward sloping demand curve, okay? So the law of demand says that if this firm wants to sell more product, it wants to increase quantity demanded, it's going to have to lower the price in order to do so. Now, what does that mean? That means that the marginal revenue curve must also be downward sloping, okay? The question is then, what does the marginal revenue curve specifically look like? Well, if we remember, marginal revenue is the change in total revenue with the production and sale of one extra unit, okay? So a firm sells an extra unit of a product, how much additional money does it put into its cash register from the sale of that product, okay? Now, we have to remember that when a firm sells a product, it doesn't sell the first unit at one price, then sell the second unit at another price, then sell the third unit at another price. If it wants to sell 3 units, it has to lower the price of all 3 units, okay? So by definition then, the marginal revenue curve must also be downward sloping, but it has to lie below the demand curve somewhere, okay? So exactly where does the marginal revenue curve lie below the demand curve? Well, if marginal revenue is change in total revenue from the production and sale of one extra unit, we know where total revenue is maximized, okay? Total revenue is maximized at the midpoint of the demand curve. Remember this? Above that, demand was elastic, okay? And below that, demand was inelastic, okay? At that point, total revenue is maximized, okay? So at that price level of the product and at that quantity sold, total revenue, P times Q, couldn't be any larger. You raise the price, total revenue goes down. You lower the price, total revenue goes down. It is maximized at that point. But because if you raise the price, total revenue falls, or if you lower the price, total revenue falls, it must be the case then that at that midpoint quantity level, marginal revenue is 0. Now, if we imagine at the first unit sold, the marginal revenue would necessarily equal the marginal benefit of the product, then it must be the case that the marginal revenue curve is downward sloping, lies below the demand curve, and crosses the horizontal axis, crosses the horizontal axis at the midpoint of the demand curve, okay? How do I know that? Because again, if prices are above the midpoint price level, if I lower the price, guess what? I gain revenue, okay? If I'm priced at the midpoint level and I lower my price, guess what? I lose revenue, okay? How can I show that? Well, assume that I'm priced up here, okay? And I'm selling Q prime units of the product and I'm priced at P prime. Well, if I lower the price to P double prime, okay, we already know that I should pick up revenue. How do I know I'm picking up revenue, gaining revenue? Because marginal revenue is positive at that point. In other words, I am adding to total revenue by that amount right there, okay? Below this level, assume I'm priced, exactly at the midpoint price level. Okay, so we'll call this P prime here. And assume I lower the price to P double prime. Okay, now I know that I should be losing revenue. My revenue should be shrinking from the discussion we just had. How do I know that? Because at that price level, my marginal revenue is negative. In other words, my total revenue has shrunk by that much there. Okay? Make a long story short. A monopolist faces a downward sloping demand curve. That means that marginal revenue must also be downward sloping. The fact that a monopolist, in order for a monopolist to sell more product, they have to lower the price of their product, but not just of that next unit they sell, but of all the units they sell, means then that not only is marginal revenue downward sloping like demand, it has to lie below the demand curve. Question then is, okay, where below the demand curve does it lie? Well, it must lie in such a fashion that it crosses the horizontal axis at the midpoint of the demand curve, because that's where marginal revenue is 0. Okay? Lowering prices at Q's related to price levels to the left of that midpoint necessarily means I'm increasing revenue. Beyond that point, I'm decreasing revenue because marginal revenue is negative.